mode.
Hi there, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We've still got people signing in like crazy. I'm seeing the numbers jump up. So I'll just start out first of all by introducing myself and what I'm going to cover in today's talk. So first off, I'm Lindsay Herbert. I'm the Global Head of Digital at Precedent. And yes, I know that that's a very nonsense sounding job title. So basically what my job is, I like to say that I've actually got the best job in the world. It splits into two parts. The first part of it is a bit of what I'm doing right now, actually. It's our thought leadership. It's doing things like writing our reports and white papers, but it's also traveling around to our different offices around the world. We've got offices in Australia, in Hong Kong, as well as here across the UK, traveling to those different offices and finding out from all of our different clients and the different sectors we work in what challenges there are that people are facing in digital and what interesting and innovative ways people are meeting those challenges. So gathering a lot of that information and making sure that that's shared across all the different projects that we do and that thought leadership that we produce. So that's the first part. The second part of my job is actually applying all of this great information. So I direct projects, usually our large-scale projects across the company, and I think that's an important thing to note. You're going to see examples of my own projects in this seminar, but I think the reason it's important to note is that it's very easy to just talk about digital and all the great things that you can do, especially when you talk about something big like digital transformation. But we all know that when you go to apply it, that's where the real challenges come in. And so knowing actually what kind of barriers you're likely to face, especially in higher education, within a university setting. I've been there in the trenches, and I know what kind of challenges you're facing. So that's me. That's my role in a nutshell. In terms of what I'm going to talk about in this webinar, now I've got an hour, which isn't very long, really. This talk is actually part of a much longer seminar. I actually premiered it at the NUAS conference, which is the higher education conference for Scandinavian universities. I was very fortunate. They invited me to be one of the keynotes for their conference. And the reason for putting the talk together and what I talked about over in Scandinavia, I also recently did a version of this talk for the Guardian here in London. The reason for putting this talk together is I wanted to try to break down this idea of building a digital culture in higher education in three separate stages. We all know that in a complex and a large organization, especially universities, trying to introduce major change is not something that you can do in one business case, in one project. It's something that's going to take a lot of iterative and collaborative work, and especially it's going to have to be introduced discreetly. So I wanted to put this talk together, and we're going to have, we're releasing a white paper as well, but I wanted to put it together to start to show how you can approach that job of building that digital culture, even if you're really very early in the beginning stages. So what I'm going to talk about today, it's going to form about three parts. The first is just talking about what is digital transformation for higher ed, what are the sort of aspirational points and the common barriers that you're likely to encounter. The second part is some inspiration from the private sector, talking through the three stages of transformation, and then leading into the last part, which is actually going to be, I'm going to use three different case studies from higher ed institutions, ones that I've worked with, we worked with across Precedent, illustrating the three different stages and giving you some practical tips as part of that that you can start implementing yourselves, that you can take away even as soon as you finish watching this webinar. So just from a housekeeping perspective, if you do have any questions, you'll notice that there is a questions panel as part of the GoToWebinar. Please feel free to submit questions. You've got a choice to submit publicly, or you can submit privately so that just I see the question. I'm going to try to leave time for questions at the end. If I run out of time, or if you can't get your question typed up fast enough, then we will send an invitation round after this webinar for a LinkedIn group so that we can have discussions in the LinkedIn group. So you can feel free to post your question there. But I'm going to get started. If any technical problems happen, you stop being able to hear, anything like that, please reply to the person that you received your email invitation from, because she's on standby, my colleague Britt, and she can help out with any technical problems. All right, so but without further ado, I'm going to get started here. And I just wanted to start out, first of all, by laying out the scenes. So these are just some of the universities that we work with at Precedent. So we're a digital agency, we're a strategic agency, and we really worked across the gamut of all different sorts of universities, both from the high-ranking down to the specialist, both in the UK as well as across Asia Pacific. And it's from this experience that we've drawn these recommendations and this framework that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But before I go into our case studies, before I kind of set out those practical tips, I wanted to bring everyone down to at least a common definition here. Oh, and there we go. And I'm just going to double check. Can you still see the screen, Brent? Yeah, okay, great. I just had to close my panel, my speakers panel. So getting us all down to a common definition. What is digital transformation? Well, I like to define it as this. So evolving an organization's ways of working in order to continue delivering its mission in the face of changing technology, competition, audience need, and behavior. But you know what the most important word out of all of that for me is? It's actually the word mission, because transformation of any form or introducing a digital culture, you know, it's all about trying to deliver your mission, that original reason that you were founded. And that's why it's so important to keep that in mind and at the heart of whatever planning it is that you're doing. And that's how you're also going to rally other staff, other faculties, other people around your institutions to want to make that change, is if you can draw it right back to that mission, you know, achieving better what it is that you set out to achieve in that first place. And the reason why this is important is that everybody loves transformation, and transformation can be a dangerous topic, especially digital transformation, because you talk about what digital can do at, you know, a top level, at a board level meeting, and everybody is nodding in agreement until it comes time to assign a budget to it, until it comes time to assign responsibilities and roles to it. And then suddenly it's the thing that senior leadership are the most likely to push into the future, because it is a huge amount of work. You know, I like to say that digital transformation in particular isn't really about technology. It's about changing people's ways of working around that new technology. That's what makes it difficult. It's not complex, it's just hard work. Now, to illustrate this, I took this list from Perry Hewitt. Now, she's the Chief Digital Officer for Harvard, and these are her 10 best practices for dealing with digital transformation. So they include things like building a high-performance digital team, creating an atmosphere of collaboration, baking data-informed thinking into the culture, the fact that management needs to live digital, you know, and all of these points are absolutely true. And this is kind of like a checklist for if you were to succeed in building a digital culture in your institutions, you would have all of these things, no doubt. The problem, of course, being that most institutions are so far away from even getting these sorts of topics in the discussion agenda, that it's almost more like a dream list than it is a checklist. Because we know we're facing common barriers. So from working with higher ed institutions, you know, Precedent, we work with over 40. I've worked with 6 different higher ed institutions in depth. And I'd say the thing that they all have in common, first of all, this idea of departments being trapped in silos. Faculties work very separately from everybody else. Central marketing feels very separated from everybody else. And there's a constant power struggle as a result of this. We are also dealing with traditional cultures and mindsets. Just even the fact that academics by nature are rewarded for being risk averse, rewarded for arguing well, for spotting holes in things. I mean, these are your internal audiences of people that you're trying to rally around change. And then, of course, it extends into things like, yes, it's slow moving. Everything needs to be evidence-based, where in digital, it's very hard to come up with evidence for new things. You're dealing with small budgets, and the fact that the audience knowledge, the gaps in between what internal language you might use to describe things within your university, your audience, some of them might be just as expert as you, say they're graduate or undergrads going up to doing a postgrad straight away. They might know the lingo just as well as you do, whereas people coming from outside, completely external, might have absolutely no idea some of the terms that are being used. So those are the standard barriers. What are the reasons to change? First of all, the students are digital first, so that's the most obvious. Then we've got competition coming in from the private sector. So the private sector being anybody from, Google offering courses, the fact that, I mean, even myself, I did a journalism degree. If I'd have had the choice to do a journalism degree with Bloomberg, would I have chosen the university that I ended up studying at? These are the sorts of threats that are coming in, as well as competition from other countries. The fact that countries that were considered as having an underdeveloped university offering before now suddenly are upping their game and stealing back their international students that would have otherwise come overseas. And then, of course, the competition for top talent, the fact that traditional education itself is under scrutiny, and this last idea that course shelf life is only going to get shorter. And how are you going to be able to keep up to date all of the material that you need to be teaching people when you've got all these non-collaborative and traditional structures kind of binding everybody into doing the same business as usual? So I could talk about transformation in the form of before and after, where you are now versus where you want to be next. And I thought to help start to build that vision, it would be useful to talk about 6 different global trends. So now these 6 trends are trends that are affecting every country, every sector, and basically everyone as a result of how wide sweeping they are. So I'm going to talk through the 6 trends, and as I talk through them, I'd like you to start to think about what your new vision, what your vision for change could be, or your before and after could be. So the first one being the most obvious one, Generation Z, our upcoming crop of future undergrads, and the fact that they just don't want what came before them. They've been described as the puritanical generation, whereas the Gen Ys, even as recent as that, were interested in social experiences and partying. Generation Z are a bit more focused on solving some of those big world problems that the generations before them helped to create. They've inherited it, and now they're quite serious, they're quite applied, and the way that they're used to communicating and interacting in the world is just radically different as a result of the technology that they've grown up with. The next global trend, this stat actually comes from a study that was done out of Oxford. So 47% of all jobs will disappear over the next 20 years. And I've got our Google self-driving cars here as an illustration. But what's the implication for that for university sector? How would your university of the future contend with the fact that almost half of the jobs that we see in the marketplace right now aren't going to be available? And how can you actually treat that as an opportunity for creating opportunity in the form of learning for those students? Number 3, global as a concept is achievable for anybody. And the fact that everybody is a jet setter, it used to be that to be a global business or to be a global institution, you had to be quite big. Now, all you need is the clever use of technology. And the fact that students themselves have an expectation to be able to collaborate, researchers have the expectation to be able to collaborate with people around the world. How is technology in your university's future going to facilitate this? Number 4, we experience life through our devices. Now, this is funny. This picture was actually sent to me by, I had my wedding recently, and the wedding photographer sent this photo to me as an illustration of, please don't ask family and friends to take as many pictures as possible during the ceremony, because they can oftentimes ruin what would otherwise be a lovely photo op for the professional photographers. And it's not just that we're experiencing life through our camera phones, we're also experiencing this phenomenon that's been researched, and now there's some really interesting stats and studies relating to how as humans, we're starting to lease out parts of our memories to our mobile phones, to our devices, that at all times there's a portion of our brain that's monitoring what our phone is doing, where it is it ringing, is it not ringing? And this whole phenomenon of a phantom vibration coming from your phone is actually a direct result of this change in our brains. So how are you going to embrace that rather than see it as a threat and the fact that students are using these connected devices? How could your university of the future see this as an opportunity? Number 6, cybercrime. It's in a pretty terrifying state. The fact that it's escalating, that no device or platform is safe. How are you going to protect students in the future and staff and things like intellectual property? Or is the protection of intellectual property as important nowadays as it once was in the past? Or are things like, is the internet changing our perception of things like copyright, for example? But this idea of cybercrime and identity and online identity, how is the university of the future going to account for this? And the last global trend, number 6, local, bespoke, and personalized. Now, these are buzzwords that we hear all the time at Precedent. And the reason for that is that they are the new big business. Everybody, all consumers, students and customers alike, have this expectation for things to be personalized to them, from what's written on their Coca-Cola bottle all the way through to what kind of prospectus they're going to get in the mail. So your university of the future, how is it going to embrace this trend, embrace this opportunity, and what sorts of technology and content are you going to produce as a result of this? So those are the 6 trends, and all of it's adding up to a very fundamental question, which is, how would you look if you were founded today? If you didn't have all the legacy and you didn't have all the structure and the technology problems holding you back, what would be that vision for the future if you were starting from scratch? What would your university's vision be? What would your university offer in the form of courses and services? How would you manage and teach? And perhaps the most important question of all, what would it look like online? And why is this the most important question? Well, because this is where you have access to that global population, this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is where your opportunity is to be customized and personalized, and it's here where you actually can be starting. That vision of the future can start and should start here, and there are lots of different opportunities and ways that you can go about addressing it. So what I'd like to do now is talk about this idea, this before and after, and how you can start to achieve some of those after states, looking to build a digital culture. And I'm going to talk about it in 3 different stages of transformation. The 3 different stages, basically you could interpret them as beginner, intermediate, advanced, but because it's a higher ed talk, I thought that I would use some of the lingo. The stages break down as surface, audience, and total, or if we were going to give it an acronym, SAT. So starting with surface. So surface being a superficial change that is intended to test the case for bigger transformation. The next level down, we've got audience transformation. Here's where we're transforming just the audience experience within the existing constraints of the institution, through to the final level of transformation, which is total, complete and considered transformation inside and out. So you can see how we start out with surface, something that is just about perception, through to audience, which is about improving the audience or the student experience, and then right back down to total, where we're looking at that inside and out transformation. And I wanted to give one example of transformation across these 3 levels, and I thought I would use a household name to illustrate this. So I want to give you some before and after inspiration first, in the form of John Lewis. Now, John Lewis, you might not realize, but about 8 years ago, John Lewis was actually hitting some rough water. So this is an excerpt from The Guardian from about 8 years ago, talking about how John Lewis was experiencing its first ever sales decline. And essentially it features the managing director for John Lewis commenting in the article about how, well, the recession is finally hitting us. There are all sorts of factors that are contributing to the downturn in sales. For example, climate change is affecting us. The fact that it's getting harder harder and harder to predict when summer is going to happen. It makes it hard for us to decide what clothing to stock in our shops. But it's more than that. It's changes in consumer behavior. It's, it's all across the board. This is what's attributing to the downturn. Now, if you think about it, John Lewis had a choice. In the same way that a university has a choice. All of these factors are true, and all of these large global changes that were starting to affect John Lewis's sales, well, they could have accepted that. They could have just decided that, they were still profitable, they were still making a profit, but they just weren't going to grow or be as profitable as they originally had been. But instead, they decided to reinvest. They decided to start looking at digital and digital ways in order to start correcting for that downturn, to the extent that now John Lewis is actually looking at launching online personalization. It's doing some of the most advanced techniques. In fact, it's even funding its own J-Labs initiative, which is seeding companies with money who can come up with interesting innovations that John Lewis can then use into its shops. But the key point to take from all of this is that John Lewis did not make this change overnight. This was over the course of 8 years that they were making these changes. And they started out very small. They started with surface level changes. Now, those surface changes were informed by quite a lot of data. And this is an example. This is the cover of the John Lewis Retail Report from 2014, How We Shop, Live, Look, or Live and Look. And this is a really interesting read. You can access this report online. It's in the public domain. And it's all about the changes that John Lewis were perceiving in the way that we use John Lewis, the way that we shop, from details like the rise of the sleepless shopper, the fact that we're spending more money in the middle of the night now because we can't sleep, so we're browsing the John Lewis website on our mobile phone or on our tablets. Well, what sort of impact did a behavior change like that, what is that going to mean for a store like John Lewis? Well, before, when they didn't know this information, they would have had customer service people sign out and go home for the evening. And if something happened to the website in the middle of the night, oh, well, it's not business hours, so we don't need to be too concerned about it. Now, however, because they know that this sleepless shopper thing is a phenomenon and big source of income for them, they're able to put more staff on across irregular hours. They're able to make sure that the website is up and running and has a more robust fallback solution in the middle of the night. Because, as you can imagine, someone who wakes up the next morning after having their purchase fail to go through, they're not really likely to try that purchase again. Instead, they're probably thinking, thank God I didn't buy that dryer at 2 a.m. Now, there are all sorts of changes that they picked up on as a result of getting these insights, analyzing their data. And one of the biggest things that they realized was the connection between offline to online. The fact that, and it's the same in higher education, it's the same in any sector, that it's not two separate audiences, one online audience and then the other the face-to-face audience. In fact, we're all using all channels all the time. And so that led to some big changes across John Lewis. So first of all, the increase in mobile usage for the website led John Lewis, they knew they had to make everything mobile accessible. So they revamped the website, they made everything accessible on mobile and tablet, but they also started launching initiatives in store, things like digital signage and kiosks and things, so that you were able to connect the experience on your mobile to the experience when you're actually walking around in the store. Same thing with the usage of apps. But probably the biggest change for John Lewis, and the one that was the most transformational, again, came from the insights that they learned about their shoppers, which is that there's a unique thing about a John Lewis shopper. A John Lewis shopper, after browsing around on the website and choosing what items they want to buy online, actually has a preference for click and collect over having it delivered to their house. So this was big for John Lewis. This made them realize that basically they had a choice. They could either make some big changes to the way that click and collect works in the stores, or they could ignore this fact and they could just carry on treating them as two separate audiences. So they decided to make the investment. Now, this meant big changes. This meant training up staff in the stores. This meant changing the infrastructure in some of the stores, moving things around, making it easier to do the click and collect process. They even started going a little bit farther, so allowing people to pick up John Lewis purchases at their local Waitrose, having lockers that can be accessed remotely with PIN codes outside of train stations so that you can pick up your orders there. You know, all sorts of different innovations that they're testing and prototyping all the time, all to try to get that shopping experience as seamless as possible from online to offline. And the result of all of this investment and all of this long-term change over those 8 years? Well, John Lewis set a sales target for online, and this was set last year. Actually, it was set several years ago, but the target was meant to be reached last year. Instead, the target was reached an entire year early, and it was £1 billion in online sales. So that's John Lewis. And the reason I wanted to share the John Lewis example is that whilst it's retail and whilst it's consumer focused, there's one thing that John Lewis does have in common with the higher education sector, apart from the fact that it's a very old organization. John Lewis was founded in the 1800s. But the fact that the challenge is in meeting the offline with the online and understanding that the constantly changing needs of a very diverse audience base. So now that we've got our inspiration from the retail sector, what I'd like to do is spend the rest of this time talking through the 3 different stages of transformation, but using some of Precedent's own case studies, some of our own clients, to illustrate how these stages could work. Now, that's not to say that you can't do this transformation yourselves in-house, absolutely not. But the idea being to show where we could help or where there is support available, especially with some of the bigger levels of transformation. Starting with surface transformation. So this idea of a superficial change to test the case for bigger transformation. And for this one, I'm going to use Cardiff University, because Cardiff University, back when the tuition prices were increased, back when those hikes were introduced, Cardiff was in a very interesting position. This was their website at the time, and fairly typical website, and they were in a very comfortable position. Before the tuition hikes were introduced, Cardiff could basically just pick all the top students from Wales, and all of the other Russell Group universities in England, would take the top students from England, and it was a comfortable relationship. Well, what happened with the tuition hikes was, first of all, the Welsh government announced that it was going to subsidize Welsh students to study during the hike period, and this is still the case. They still get a grant to study. The unfortunate thing for Cardiff University being that those Welsh students would get the grant regardless of whether they studied in Wales or anywhere else in the UK. So for the first time ever, Cardiff was seeing competitors marketing to its students on its home turf. And as a result of this, we got from Cardiff University the best brief I have ever received, even to this day, which was, we need to do something, and we need to do it digitally because we don't have any time, and we need to do it urgently because we've got September coming up and we don't want to have any of our places unfilled, and we don't want to see a drop in the quality of those students. And so the rest of it was for Precedent to fill in. And this was what we were facing. This was the mood at the time. In fact, people in the sector didn't know if students' attitudes had even changed to higher education. Were they still wanting to come to university? There was a lot of anger and there was a lot of hype in the media. So what we ended up doing was a little bit like John Lewis. We investigated. We found out from students, existing students at Cardiff, why they had chosen Cardiff over other Russell Group universities. And the answer was really clear. The students liked the support that was given to them, the things beyond just the academic rigor that was going to help them ensure that they were going to be successful. Now, we knew that we needed something to attract these students. We needed some sort of a campaign, but as you could see from the old university website, this wasn't somewhere to try anything radical or experimental. And especially to try to appeal to all of the craziness that was going on outside. So we decided to go for a microsite route. Again, a superficial change, a superficial transformation. The campaign was called Thrive. Part of it was an online scholarship competition, and that's what we were using to attract attention to the website. And then the website itself featured stories and experiences from real students. You could follow students live on Facebook. You could follow them on social media, on their actual profiles, not fake profiles set up by the university or managed by the university. And we introduced elements of this Thrive campaign across everything, including different events, so like open days. Now, what was really interesting was the case for transformation was already being made because while we were doing things like doing digital signage and Twitter walls and that kind of thing, we were noticing a strange thing happening on these open days, which was that different faculties and departments, and Cardiff had, at the time, had 27 different academic schools. Different departments were actually stealing the Thrive branding and the Thrive messaging and using it on their own kiosks and putting it on their own websites. And when I say stealing, I mean that they were taking them without asking central marketing. And when we talked to them about it, they said, well, we've actually been waiting for something like this. You know, we don't like the fact that we've been having to compete school against another school. We like the fact that Thrive is about the university as a whole and the experience as a whole. And suddenly the case for transformation was starting to be made. This allowed the director, the exec director who was sponsoring the Thrive program, to start having conversations at a very senior level across the university about bigger, more fundamental changes that could start to take place. Now, the result of the Thrive campaign itself was a massive success. Not only were all the places filled, but they were filled early at a higher quality, in some cases for some of the departments than previous. And this is something that I actually ended up presenting with that executive director at the American Marketing Association Symposium for Higher Education. At the end of the Thrive campaign, about a year after it had completed, we submitted this case study and the case study for change to the AMA, and the reason why we were invited to speak about it as the only international university allowed at the symposium was because of how the exec director had used the results of the Thrive campaign to start to have those bigger conversations at senior level, and essentially was what helped spark the bigger transformation in Cardiff, moving away from the 27 different academic schools towards the college system that it's got now. And it's not to say that the Thrive campaign did all of those changes. Instead, it's to say that a surface level transformation can help to spark that bigger change. You know, for example, Cardiff now has a central digital team. It didn't have that before. It couldn't hire those sorts of positions, didn't have the approvals to do it, whereas now, and right off the back of the Thrive campaign, it was able to hire in that expertise and create its own digital team. So in terms of learnings from Cardiff University, or talking about stage one transformation, the first thing that I would say is to tackle one problem at a time using digital, but put specific measurements in place. One of the things about the Thrive campaign was that everything was measured and benchmarked, so that on a constant level we were able to share the different victories. You know, things were tracked and we were sharing victories in a structured manner with senior leadership. And then the last thing being incentivizing the adoption of new digital tools and channels. This was a new thing for Cardiff University to be doing. And so if we didn't have that scholarship competition happening at the same time, then we wouldn't have had the uptake. We wouldn't have had the traffic that we needed to prove that business case for change. So that's stage one, that's surface transformation. What about audience transformation? Transforming the audience experience within the existing constraints of the university. Well, for this one, I'm going to use a client of mine, another client of mine. Now, this is Monash University. This is down in Australia. Monash is actually Australia's largest university and has the biggest international presence of any Australian university, with campuses around the world. The before state that we were in when we started working with Monash, well, this was their website at the time. This was about 5 years ago. And as you can see, not exactly the website you would expect of an academically leading and international university. But the reason why I wanted to choose Monash for second level transformation is a bit like Cardiff. We weren't brought in to Monash to make any major strategic changes to the way the university works. In fact, we were invited to build some new website templates. This was a website project. But it was through the website project that we were able to start uncovering and highlighting some fundamental problems and lack of planning that was going on across the university. So for example, when I first started the project, the first 3 months on the ground in Melbourne, the different academic schools wouldn't even meet at the same time together. It was so fragmented and so siloed. Not only that, the senior leadership team, I would talk to the different directors and vice chancellor, and everybody had a different view of what Monash University should be, both what it is now and what it should be in the future. For example, is Monash an international university or is it a global university? Now, lots of universities like to say that they're global. It's become a bit of a buzzword, in fact. But when it comes to a web presence, trying to show something as being global versus something as being international is a big difference. So for example, Coca-Cola is a global company. You go to the website, you choose your continent, you choose your country, global. A university like, say, Harvard is an international university. It's an American university, and its strength and its reputation comes from its American heritage. Now, it can have campuses all over the world. It's still known as an American university. And it's by trying to get together templates and information architecture and wireframes and doing user testing, all that sort of thing that we were doing for the website that allowed us to have these bigger strategic conversations with senior leaders and essentially open up the ground for discussion to change some very top level things that were happening across the university. Now, over the course of all of this, of course, we changed the website. So the university itself got its new modern website and features and functionality that it needed to navigate across all of its different course offerings, its different campuses, and that sort of thing. And we also did the same for some of its international presences, its giant Malaysia campus, South Africa. But like I said, over the course of this, we started to identify big strategic issues. And so off the back of this, we actually started to put together things like its web presence strategy. And the web presence strategy, and we've got an example up here, are all the different changes required within Monash, big fundamental changes in terms of how its departments work and how they collaborate in order to deliver the goals that the senior leadership had identified as being imperative to the university's growth. Here's an example of one of the implementation plans that we produced, but the work ended up being so far extending that Precedent ended up being made a strategic partner for the university. We sat on one of their executive panels deciding and prioritizing work and projects that needed to get done in order to make this vision a reality. And so really the key learning from Monash University is it's a lot like Cardiff. It's taking it from one step to the next. And I mean, if we had tried to come into Monash University and say, we're going to give you a big digital strategy that's going to involve restructuring your departments, we never would have been allowed to. There never would have been the budget to do it. But because we focused first on improving the student experience online, and then used a project that had very tangible outputs, i.e. a website redesign, we were able to frame bigger strategic discussions. We were able to build trust. We were able to understand the barriers internally and start to map out routes to overcome them. So those would be the key learnings there from Monash University. And once you've achieved this stage, the second stage, the audience transformation, now you've got the best, the most solid business case possible for doing the final stage of transformation, which of course is transformation inside and out, starting to actually change the mess behind the scenes to match the better experience that's being delivered externally. And for this, I'm going to use the University of Aberdeen. Now, we started working with the University of Aberdeen, like the other universities. We started working with them originally years ago. And the first project we did with them actually was to update their information architecture, their navigation on the site. It was more of a UX project that we did with them. And what was interesting, this is the website the way that it looks today. What was interesting about that project was it was so difficult. There were so many internal politics and internal barriers that came up as a result of this, that it led to, like Monash, those discussions about what was needed, bigger fundamental changes. And so the university was able to get itself to the state that Monash University did, which is that it started to fix the student experience on things like its website and in certain isolated cases. But it got to the point where it was clear that some bigger internal change was going to have to happen if they were going to take it the rest of the way. Now, this is the blog post that was written back in August 2014, so almost a year ago. And this is Mike McConnell. He's the business applications manager at the university. And it's him describing the procurement process and the reason that they've decided to undertake full inside and out digital transformation at the university. This was before Precedent was even appointed to this particular work. And it's an interesting read, and I think the key thing being that the university recognized that the changes that were needed were going to be so extreme that they were going to have to take a very considered and thought through approach and researched approach in order to make them happen. So as a result of that procurement process, Precedent, along with our partners, KPMG, we ended up coming up with an approach for the University of Aberdeen. So the idea being that it's dual pronged. So on the left-hand side, we've got Precedent, and we look at things like the digital strategy, the customer experience design, the digital service implementation, what kind of digital platforms and development and optimization need to happen. Whilst at the same time, KPMG are looking into things like the organizational strategy, where people work, how they work, what floors they work on, infrastructure, things like business process design, the culture, the capacity, the capability, and what kind of change would be needed in order to deliver to some of those customer experience strategies and goals that we'd set out. And then lastly, enterprise architecture development and optimization. So the whole idea being an inside-out approach. Now, the stage that the project is at right now is that we've given all of our recommendations. We've completed the first year of findings and discovery, and now the university are deciding the route that they're going to take forward, the first piece of major transformation they're going to undertake internally. But at the same time, one of the key things to ensure success in this ongoing program of change was identifying things like quick wins. And what I've got on screen here is an example that was identified actually by the internal team at the University of Aberdeen for changes that they could make to course pages to make them more effective. And this is something that they've designed. You're actually seeing a preview, it's not live yet, of what's going to be implemented as a result of the research that Precedent have been doing, that KPMG have been doing, that the team, the internal team, are just going to go ahead and launch themselves in order to continue gathering evidence to support this bigger case. So the key learnings here from Aberdeen. The first part is about getting the right investment. So if you're going to approach a stage 3 transformation where you're changing people's job titles, you're changing the structure in an institution, you absolutely have to get the right investment. You couldn't skip the first 2 stages of transformation in order to be able to get the right investment. You just never get the money signed off. But even once you've got that investment, it's about setting expectations and communicating the changes throughout, because from the time the project starts to the first few months to halfway through to the end, you're going to be finding some pretty shocking things that's going to want you to change the route and change some of the direction of travel. And you're going to want to be able to do that. Digital is not a fixed thing, and student expectation and behavior is not a fixed thing either, especially when you start taking into account what's happening with the competition. The next point, though, I would say is about tackling business critical processes and systems first. So, and setting those clear benchmarks and targets. And what I mean by business critical stuff is the stuff where it's obvious that you're losing money, that something is inefficient or something is failing to be successful for students. In fact, I had an example shared recently that I really liked from one of our senior consultants up in Edinburgh, Rob Van Tol. He was telling me about the University of Coventry and how they were able to leap up in the league tables by focusing on some of the metrics in the rating system that they had a particularly low score in, and it was about student feedback, giving feedback to and getting feedback back on their work from their lecturers. And because they had a low score previously, they knew that there were some clear things they'd be able to do to improve that particular score. And so they did. They introduced tools, digital tools for two-way communication. They made, they set clearer expectations. They focused all of their efforts. And as a result of that, they were able to see a drastic improvement to just that one metric that, of course, affected their overall league score. So these are the sorts of things that we're doing with Aberdeen as well. It's, with Aberdeen, it's the fact that their applications process is very inefficient. There's a lot of, a student will apply online, and then that online application will get printed out, and then it'll get scanned and re-uploaded back into a system in a different format. And, taking out unnecessary steps like that, it's an easy thing to set a benchmark for how much money and manpower it's costing, and then targets for how it could be improved if the process is revamped. And then the last example I would say here, or the last learning from Aberdeen, is identifying and completing those quick win projects. So using your existing resources so that you're not always asking for more money throughout, because the senior leadership will get fatigued from that, and also using the existing skill sets. And the quick wins aren't just to improve the student experience, and they're not just to keep the senior leadership happy that change is happening on an ongoing basis. It's also to bring the staff on board and to reassure staff and the academics and people around, internally, that change is happening, but they're being brought along for the journey, that they're not being replaced, that people's jobs aren't being threatened, giving people an opportunity to grow and learn and shine over the course of transformation, rather than coming up with a whole series of recommendations and then just suddenly out of nowhere making a lot of very big and scary changes. So those are the 3 stages of transformation. But what does it all mean? What does it all mean in the context, and especially when you're going back and going back to your regular day jobs once you've logged off of today's session? Well, I think the key things to remember here is that, first of all, everyone loves transformation and everyone loves digital, even the people who don't like digital, because they like to assign jobs to digital, and they like to assign goals and responsibilities to digital and to transformation in general, but they don't necessarily like to assign time or budget to it. And so understanding where you want to take your university, where you want to be, even in just your own role or your own department between now and then, what are the different things you can be taking into consideration to make sure that that transformation is one that actually adheres to what you're setting out to achieve? So I went through the 6 different global trends and what is going to be shaping our world tomorrow, regardless of what sector and regardless of what jobs it is that we're doing. And then the most fundamental question of all, how would you look if you were founded today? If you could just forget for a moment all the baggage of the outdated IT systems, all of the internal politics, if you were just trying to achieve your mission statement that was set out, that was laid out, and that inspired you to join your university in the first place, how would you do it today? And then from there, starting to build up that vision, answering all those fundamental questions, and then the most important question of all, what would it look like online? Because online is where you can start to make that transformation happen. And online is where you can start to see surface transformation, audience transformation, and then build that case for total transformation over the course of doing business as usual. Now, hopefully you learned a bit from today's seminar, maybe got some inspiration from it. In terms of mission statements, this is our mission statement at Precedent. And if there is anything that you need help with, that you need support with, or even would just be curious to find out a bit more on our work with other universities and how we've had some of these successes with other universities, We do digital strategy, we build websites end to end, we lead entire digital transformation programs, and we have been around for a long time. You know, we have all these experts in these different locations, and I think probably the final point, the most important point to make on this, is that change is scary, transformation is scary, but it just happens to be our business as usual. So we do have a lot of tricks and tools up our sleeve. So if you do have any questions, of course, we are going to take questions at the end of this. I'm just going to open up my panel and see if anyone's posed any questions. So please feel free to write in a question now if you've got one. Otherwise, you can also feel free to link in to me. That's my profile there on LinkedIn. And we are going to be sending around that invitation to join the discussion group. I'd really love to hear from everyone. In a way, I don't like doing these webinars because it's like talking to myself in a room for an hour and not being able to see or hear from anyone. So please let us know if you do have any questions and if you have any feedback, if you found this useful, because we're going to be doing this as a larger seminar over the course of the fall and going into the new year. So your feedback would really be helpful in shaping that content. And I'm just looking, I don't see, oh, wait, here we go. I've got one question. Will the slides be available after the webinar? Yes, absolutely. The slides will be available. And someone's asked, they had to drop out throughout, and so they've asked, has it been recorded? Can they get a link to the recorded version? And yes, I did remember to hit record at the start of this. We didn't for the last webinar, but I did for this one. And other words, I've got, for some reason I can't make my panel bigger, so it's much harder, it's too hard to read this. Do I get the feeling that, this is a question saying, do I get the feeling that things are changing in HE with regards to digital? Yes, I do. I absolutely do. And one of the things that we're seeing is really big digital teams being created within universities, which is excellent. This is exactly what should be happening. Universities as a whole should be building digital capabilities. What we see as being an unfortunate side effect of this is that they're being built in the same way that everything is built in a university, in its own silo, in its own department. And the power struggles are still happening in the same ways that have always happened within HE. And so what we're seeing in the more advanced universities, or ones, I referenced Harvard and Perry Hewitt, they're doing a really great job of taking that digital capability and decentralizing it. And so I think that's where the future is going to be for HE, is the more you can decentralize, the better. I can make this panel pop out. There we go. Now I can see the questions much more easily. Okay, next one. Next question is, how has the silo mentality been overcome? So the best way to overcome the silo mentality is by working on specific initiatives that require different departments, different faculties to collaborate. So at Cardiff University, we did it by introducing little mini projects within the Thrive campaign that we would want input from different faculties on, and then setting those little initiatives up in a way that they could keep going after the project had finished, after the campaign had finished. So that's one really great way of doing it. The other really great way is just to make the case for it. So, let's say you want to collaborate with a couple of different faculties, but you're not getting any cooperation from them. Being able to make a mini business case saying, hey, could we take some of the, this person's time, we want to have these meetings, we think we can achieve X, this is the current benchmark. That's another way that we see a lot of our clients being able to make the case for better collaboration, but you do have to do it on a smaller individual initiatives basis first before you can start doing what the University of Aberdeen are doing, which is now actually breaking down the silos. So next question. Next question is from a Precedent person who is saying, is it worth mentioning we're going to be producing an HE white paper and launching it at CASE? Yes, I should mention that. So yeah, if anyone who's listening is going to the CASE conference, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, Rob Van Tol, is going to be doing a talk at CASE, and he's going to be launching the white paper that he's just finished writing. And so yeah, definitely be on the lookout for Precedent. We're also going to have a stand at Precedent. And Last question. How on earth do we deal with legacy web content, some of which does continue to be used, and as we know, some of which doesn't get used? And yeah, that's a very good question. So legacy web content is an interesting one. There are a couple different ways you can tackle it. One of it is to just start deleting it and see who complains and see who has an issue with it. Sometimes you can delete whole swaths of content and nobody ever notices. And we've done that successfully with some of our clients in the past. Where it gets tricky is where some of the content is required for very specialist audiences, say policy regulators or things like that, and maybe a page only gets viewed by one person once a year, but that page is important to have there for legal purposes or just to keep that one stakeholder happy. I think for that, that's when you need to start looking deeper into your Google Analytics, understanding who is the owner of those pages, and then starting to decide where that content should belong. If you are keeping archives of anciently old content, does it actually belong on the main site? Is it something that could live on a separate archive site? Is it cluttering up the user experience for the main website? And then making the business case for it, showing that that users are getting confused and going off onto the wrong pages, and that kind of thing. That's one of the best ways to tackle it. I know with one of my clients, they just did a redesign, big website redesign, and the approach that they took was they got rid of everything and have been adding stuff back as it's been requested. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that approach if you think that it's going to cause huge political tension within all the different faculties, and instead to work with the different faculties to, again, really understand who those page owners are, what value they see as that content having, and the last thing the last thing I'll say on this topic is as part of a content rewriting process. So say you're launching a new website and you need all your different faculties and stuff to look at their content, rewrite it for the new website. Never assign it in a big bulk batch of content. Like never just say, hey, could you look at your section of the website and tell us which pages you need to keep? Because the answer will be 100%, we need to keep everything, because it's just too much work, and it's easier for them to have the knee-jerk reaction of keep it all than it is to go in bit by bit. So if you're planning a redesign, or if you're just planning a big content revamp, approach it in bits, small pieces, because if you and spread it out over a really long timeline, and then you'll be much more effective at getting people to agree to take down old content. If you get them to tackle a whole section, then you'll have people digging their heels in and saying that section is so important and no, we could never bother taking it down, that sort of thing. So yeah, that would be my recommendation there. But that is it for the questions, and we are 3 minutes away from the end, so I'll sign off. And again, like I said, if you could share your feedback, that would be great. You can email it in response to the email that we'll send out at the end of this, and we will send around the slides, and we will also send a link to the recording as well, so you can forward that on to any colleagues you've got who you think might benefit from listening. But thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be signing off. Bye, everyone.